Hello and welcome to the Bucket Lister podcast. Join your host Keith Crockford along with special guests who have travelled the world, here to share stories of their adventures and plenty of inspo to add to your bucket list. Now, let's get into today's episode.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of the Bucket Lister podcast. I am your host, Keith Crockford, and today I am back chatting with Lindsey Allen. Hello, Lindsey.
Hello, Keith.
So we are on part 2 of our gorilla trekking trip podcast. We've just come back from the trip, and if you listened to last week's episode, you would have listened to Tom chatting about the trip in general. We went on for nearly an hour on that one talking about the trip, but I decided to move and do it as a two-parter to take and have the gorilla trekking element have its own kind of episode of the podcast, because I felt that it was deserved. And like I said last week, like the trip is called the gorilla trekking trip, but I almost need to change the name for it, because that's not what the trip was. That was the main reason I think why people booked, but the trip also gave so much more as well. And the reason why I've asked Lindsey, and you might have listened to Lindsey do some podcasts with me before, but the main reason why I asked Lindsey to come on this one is because it's her fault the trip even exists. And I won't mention her age, but Lindsey has a special birthday this year. And one of the things she wanted to do for that special birthday was to go and see the gorillas. And I remember the phone conversation that I had with Lindsey probably about 18 months ago, where she said, "Are you putting this trip on to Uganda? Because if you don't, I'm going to go and book it with somebody else." So that's the reason why 12 of us, or 13 including me, went out to Uganda in the beginning of February to go on this trip. So thank you, Lindsey, for putting the idea into my head and also pushing me forwards to actually get it launched and get it live. I certainly didn't want to see you heading off with another company to do this trip. That would have hurt me even more. So, but Lindsey, obviously, the reason you booked the trip was because you wanted to go and see gorillas, mountain gorillas in the jungle. Obviously, there are only 3 places in the world where you can do that. We've got Rwanda, you've got Uganda, and they're also in the Congo as well. But as we said on last week's podcast, with what's happening in the Congo at the minute, you probably don't want to be heading there. And like we also said, if you haven't listened to last week's one, that there is there's a big difference in the permit costs between Uganda and Rwanda. Most people tend to go to Rwanda for gorillas. And I have written a blog post about Uganda versus Rwanda and the plus and the cons for both, which I'll put a link to that in the show notes as well. But the difference in price is it's $1,500 per day for Rwanda to go gorilla trekking, and it's $700 to go in Uganda to go gorilla trekking. So there is a big difference in the costs. And just bearing in mind, that's just for the permit for one day. That's not you getting there. That's not everything else. That's just for your permit. So it is a big cost of the trip. It is a big proportion of the trip. And probably you're not going to go and do it for more than one day, in essence, when you're on a trip. So, you've really got to think about this. But so we chose to go to Uganda mainly because of the price point, but also the other reason was for what Uganda also has to offer in terms of safaris and filling the rest of the trip, because obviously you don't want to go all that way just for a one-day experience. You've got to add other things into it. So, Lindsey, did we manage to put together an itinerary that kind of ticked all of those boxes?
Yes.
There we are. And that's the end of the podcast.
End of the podcast. No, I did say to you I wanted a gorilla trip, and you went away and you were making the itinerary, and I kind of left you alone and didn't pester you about I wanted this and I wanted that. I think I was just happy doing the gorilla trekking. When you came back with the itinerary, I nearly fell off my seat. The whole sort of safari trips, the seeing the chimps, spending time with lions, which are one of my favourite animals, the collared lions. It was like you'd read my mind and sort of put the trip together. it was everything that I was looking for and a lot more. So yes, I'll let you off with this one. You did a good one.
Oh, there we are. So, and ultimately, we're going to be talking about the gorillas today. But how did you find the rest of the trip as a whole?
I thought it was really goodly, well balanced. It was lots of driving, but we did get to see probably about 60%, 70% of the actual country driving around. So it was a lot of time in the vehicles, but in between the vehicles, it was just amazing experiences, one after the other. Every day sort of stepped up a bit more. I love the travelling. I'm not one for sleeping. When we travel, I love to look out the window and see the world go by and actually see part of the country. So I really enjoyed, whether it was the sort of 6-7 hours a day in the van, or whether it was being out on safari. Everybody commented, even on the safari trips, I don't sit down, I'm out. My eyes are constantly searching the sort of sides, looking for whatever I can spot. So yeah, absolutely amazing, well balanced trip.
Yeah, and I think there was a lot of driving in it, and there was a lot of time in the vehicles. The vehicles were fairly comfortable. We had 2 vehicles split between the group, so you were in sort of smaller vans, but there was only kind of like 5 people in our van. You had a fridge in the van that was constantly stocked up with water. There was lots of stops on the way. I don't think we were ever sort of driving for more than like 2 hours at a time before we had to stop in. We'd have a toilet stop, or we'd stop at a hotel or a petrol station so people could get snacks and, go to the toilet and stretch your legs. And, we'd have sort of a half an hour stop at each one, which I think broke the day up quite nicely.
Yeah. And it was nice as well. Every time we did the big drive, we got to a hotel that had a pool, or a lodge that had a pool, so we could go and have a splash around in the pool, a bit of a swim, maybe a beer before freshening up properly.
Yeah, and a 120 Nile special was always well received, wasn't it? I think that was one of the biggest comments from people, that when they went to clear their bar bills in the morning, they couldn't believe how cheap their bar bill was.
Yeah, we had 1 or 2 maybe slightly heavier drinkers on this trip, and it was all down, I think, to the fact that it was £1.30, £1.20 for a large bottle of very nice beer.
Yeah, exactly that. So obviously the gorilla trekking takes place in the Bwindi National Park. That was the furthest point. You're almost on the Rwandan border at that point. So it was at the end of the trip. We had traveled all the way down through. And as we said last week on last week's podcast, that people were kind of thinking that the day before or the day before that or the day before that was going to take some beating because it was the perfect day, was the kind of the joke of the trip of how perfect that day was. But obviously for me, and what I wanted was that for everyone to have the gorilla trekking was going to be the perfect day. And obviously as a tour guide, as I put this trip together, I think if we hadn't seen any gorillas, then I think I'd have been left in Uganda. But, we were...
You'd have had the same fate as Brian, our guide, who laughed when he said, what happens if we don't see gorillas? And I said, it's simple, we kill you.
Yeah. He did look slightly worried.
Until we see them.
So let's just talk about the gorilla trekking day as a whole. So obviously all of our permits and everything had all been organised before we got there. We kind of had a 6 a.m. start, I think it was. We had to get there for sort of 7 o'clock for the briefing in the morning. And, we arrived at the gate of the national park. And talk us through the experience.
Yes, we all decamped from our vehicles at the entrance to the national park, all went and sat in this lovely little hut. There seemed to be lots and lots of seats in the hut, but we were the first ones in there, and it really quite quickly filled up with everybody. It's probably about 150 people in total that were there for the day. And one of the main rangers came down and gave us an introduction to Bwindi Impenetrable Forest National Park, told us a bit about the amount of monkeys and the amount of gorillas and that they had there, told us a bit about the permits, all really sort of useful stuff. We then had some locals came down from, I think it's going to kill me with all the pronunciations. The Rushaga area, the locals from the community there came down, and they did their usual, what we found was the usual for Uganda, welcome song. And then they started doing some welcome dances as well. Obviously, not many of us could speak much in the way of Lugandan or their sort of local dialect, but little actions and that you could see they were just singing about gorillas sleeping and gorillas playing and all the rest of it. So that it was. They did go on for a bit. It was, I think they did about 6 or 7 dances and everybody was looking at their watches and that. But at some point during that welcome dance presentation thing, it smacked me about the face what we were about to do, and realization really hit me what we were about to do. And the tears started. And I thought, nobody's going to see me. I'm going to sit here with my shades on. Nobody's going to notice. And sort of very carefully went into my bag and pulled out a single tissue, didn't even pull the full packet out, looked around and noticed nearly everybody in the group was doing the same. And I thought, well, that's okay. It's not just me. And I think it was just at that point we were like, bloody hell, in 20 minutes, whatever, when they finished their 15th dance, we're going to get up and go and see gorillas. And it was like driving into a brick wall with me. So we all had a bit of a laugh about it, calling ourselves daft things and all the rest of it. They finished their presentation. We then got split into smaller groups. So I think there's a maximum of 8 per group can go out on the trips. So we were split into our groups, given our ranges, and told the family group we were going to go looking for. And again, pronunciation. Mukunguzi, I've got down as the family name we were going to go and see. And again, as we were sort of studying our groups, the guide was telling us a bit about the family. We got told we had 17 in our group. The main silverback was called Mukunguzi, which means saviour, which the story sort of hit me a bit because it was a previous family of females that lost their silverback. He died. They didn't say how he died. They just said he died. So the females were getting on with it on themselves. And this silverback came along and saved the family. Therefore, they called him Mukunguzi, and the whole family's now called Mukunguzi. And I thought to myself, those females were getting along with themselves quite happily, but obviously nature wouldn't have happened. But
they're going to say they might have struggled to continue to get on well with themselves. And I think that's, just to put some context into all of this, like they reckon there are only 1,063 mountain gorillas left in the world. That has gone up massively over the last sort of 20 years since conservation has been in place. We were told there were 28 families in the Bwindi National Park, of which 18 of those families have been introduced to humans. So those 18 families are the ones that are being tracked. The rules are quite strict with the tracking, in the fact that only each family can be tracked once a day, and then you can only spend an hour with the family each day. So they will, so they only get an hour of human interaction each day with groups. And then also as well, the thing that really interests me was that obviously, as Lindsey said, there was lots of people there at the start. Not everyone was doing the same. There's lots of different things you can do in the forest. So not everyone was doing the same program that we were doing. But obviously, so some families won't be tracked each day by humans, although the local rangers will still go out and check that family every single day. So they will still have some human interaction. It just won't be with such a big group. There might just be 2 local rangers that go out. And then what they do is they give each family a break. So if only, 2 or 3 groups are going out that day, they'll make sure that they get a break the next day if there's that opportunity. And I think the lovely thing from us was, and I was speaking to our local guide, and I was actually in the same group as Lindsey was. And they had been told that a couple of weeks ago, they got an email from the national park to say that there was some babies that had just been born, and but they wouldn't mention which family the babies were connected with. And luckily for us, when we were getting our briefing, we were told the family we were going to track was the one with 3 new babies in it, and they had a 2, a 3, and a 4-week baby in it. So, that was just amazing to know that we were going to have that opportunity to go out and do that.
Yeah, I remember when they were saying that, and I looked at you in the group when he said that we had the 2, 3, and 4-week-old babies, and you always said something to me like, "Now calm down and don't kick off again."
Yeah,
It was just like everything was just building at that point, wasn't it? It was. At that point we just needed to see them, but we were still at the entrance to the national park.
Yeah. And and the thing is, they say that your experience could be anything from 2 hours to 8 hours before, trekking before you actually go and find them. And they gave us in the briefing, didn't they, and said that they send out, there's local trackers that go out 2 hours before you do to start tracking that family, so they can get on the right path, so they can sort of let us know which direction we kind of need to start heading in. But they were kind of very vague with where they are or how far we were going that day, wouldn't it?
Yeah, every time he was asked, our guide was like, "Yes, they're only a matter of minutes or maybe hours away." Very, very vague.
And obviously, in terms of like what you need to wear, you need a good pair of boots on, don't you? You need to have, you are walking basically through what they call the impenetrable forest, and it really was like that. So long trousers, good walking boots. You need long socks that you can pull up over your trousers to stop things from landing in them. And then you want long sleeves as well, because you're literally brushing past things all the time, aren't you?
Yeah. And a good tip that we got as well before we went was gardening gloves. Don't be taking any trekking gloves or anything with you. It's proper thorns gardening gloves for when you if you're needing to pull vines and things to pull yourself up a bit of a hill or yeah. So yeah, and it's hot as well. So you've got all these layers on, and it's red hot. So it's not the most comfortable, but it's worth it.
It's very humid, isn't it? I mean,
yeah.
we were chatting to a chap who was staying at the lodge before. When we arrived at the lodge the night before, there was a chap who had been and done it the day, or he'd done it that day. And we were chatting to him about his experience, and he was like, "Yeah, we found the gorillas within 20 minutes of trekking." And I think when he was explaining that, I think our heart sank a little bit, didn't it? Because we were kind of like, we want the experience. We don't want it to feel like we're just wandering into a zoo and there they're going to be, and we come straight back out again.
And we love the mountains, don't we? So we wanted to be there trekking. It was seeing the gorillas was the major part of it, but also doing a trek, getting on your feet for a bit after sitting on the bus for a couple of days, and walking through the jungle. I'd said to a couple of people I'd have much preferred to have done 8 hours in the jungle and finding them. I wouldn't want to do 8 hours and not find them, but 8 hours and finding them rather than a 20-minute walk into the jungle, seeing them and coming straight back out again.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. I think, we'll get on to how far we had to walk in a minute. But the other thing you can have is you can have a porter as well. And originally I was like, no, I'm not gonna bother with a porter. I don't need a porter. And I think you read lots of stuff on the internet about how hard it is trekking in the jungle, and that you've got to be really fit and all of these sorts of things. But I think I think there's a bit of bigging that up a little bit in terms of, I think, for our clients, I think a couple of them might have struggled a little bit. For the majority of our clients who were there, who have potentially done Kilimanjaros, Everest base camps and things like that, I think, they're describing it as being challenging for those that don't do anything.
Yeah.
Was that your kind of impression of the trek?
Yeah, and it amused me because this is going to stick with me, and I've seen a video of it, and they do cater for everybody. They cater for people who aren't used to trekking. They cater for people who are slightly older, And they also cater for old and infirm. And if you are through whatever sort of disability, age, whatever, you can still get into that forest if you have an extra bit of money. And it was something, was it $300 or something?
$300 for a stretcher.
They will stick you on a stretcher and carry you in there so you can still see the gorillas. So, yeah, gorilla trekking is for everybody. Some will find it easier than others. And if you are somebody who loves being in the mountains and the hills, then, unless it's raining, and it could get very muddy. We fortunately in our group missed the rain or just got back to the jeeps when the rain hit. But yeah, it was a hot trek, but it wasn't a particularly tough trek.
So I wasn't going to have a porter because I was like, I don't need a porter. Like, we won't carry in anything. It was a day pack with some water in and a waterproof jacket. That was pretty much it. But then I got told the story of the porters. And at that point, it was kind of a no-brainer that I had to pay someone to carry my bag. And the reason for that was because they had a massive poaching issue in the forest from the local people. And to try and prevent them from going in, because obviously they used to go in and not necessarily the mountain gorillas, but they used to go and poach in the forest to eat and whatever, and to provide for their families. And obviously what they're trying to do now is create this conservation area that's there for tourism to support the local community as well. And what they've gone and done is they give the porters the option once a month to go on a rota to be able to be a porter. And I just thought that if I don't take a porter out today, that one person that's going to be left behind is now going to have to wait another 30 days before he gets his opportunity to earn another $30. So at that point, it then became a complete and utter no-brainer that I'm not going to take away that opportunity for someone to do that. And actually, in the end, it was quite nice walking without a bag. And he walked alongside me the whole time. Like every time we stopped, he would be there so I could get my water out the bag. And his English was also very, very good as well. And I learned so much off him because, we spent a long time walking next to each other, and I was just really interested, and he was interested in me and where I'd come from and what we had been doing. So it was just kind of quite nice to have somebody different to talk to, I found.
Yeah. And as you say, you were sort of, because they were local, you were finding out a lot more about the local ways. I mean, we did start my normal conversation about football and that, because they do love their football out there. But yeah, sort of finding out their ways and finding that sort of the rest of the 29 days of the month, they're just doing farming for their friends and not actually bringing any money into their family. And it is just that one day a month where they have the opportunity to do it. It was so nice. And as you say, it was almost like catching up with somebody, sort of like nattering away on the trail as you were going up. And they went over and above. Every time there was a slight step up, they'd be there with the handout, even whether you needed it or not. They were there sort of helping you. It was really lovely people.
Yeah, no, it was, I think that added to the experience, I think, at the end of the day. And, they give you you get a stick. They give you a stick to help walk with that you can use. Some people had trekking poles with them. Other people, I think everyone used a stick. If they didn't have a trekking pole, they took a stick as well. And that was actually kind of quite handy. They weren't just a stick.
They were lovely crafted walking staffs with carvings of gorillas on the top. You make them sound like they just picked something up at the side of the jungle.
Well, you might have been lucky to have one with a gorilla carved on the top, but I didn't have one with a gorilla carved on the top, okay? And I think the other lovely thing about it as well was you pay these porters at the end of the trek, and you give them the money and they put the money in their pocket. And it was very clear that the whole $30 was going to that person. It wasn't like somebody was creaming some off the top. Like they took the full $30, which I think, that also for me, like made it even better that I had employed this person for the day. And, like I say, my one, we were chatting away and he wants to set up a shop. and he wants to set up a shop in his village selling books and pens, and he needs 2 million shillings to achieve this, and he's got a flock of sheep that he's feeding up to then go and sell the sheep to get the money. And it was just really interesting to hear their way of life, of what they were doing.
You tipped him a sheep, didn't you, when you finished?
I did tip him a sheep, yeah. I was surprised at the cost of a sheep, and I decided to buy him another sheep. So I gave him another tip on top of his money so he could go and get himself a sheep. Whether he buys a sheep with it or he goes and drinks some Nile Special, I'm not sure about that one. But I felt good about buying a sheep for him. Right then, so we left the park gate, we got back in the vehicles, and we were going up to our starting point, and kind of it was a bit like the kamikaze run, wasn't it? Everyone got into vehicles and all kind of shot off in different directions with their groups, didn't they?
Yeah, so obviously the trackers had been in touch with the guides and told them, I think there's like 4 entrances to the actual forest, and they picked out which one was easiest for us to get to. And at first, again, I felt a bit like we'd been robbed because we were getting in the car going somewhere rather than trekking. But after sort of a few climbs in the hills and that, and we were in the car for about 20 minutes because they are quite bad basic roads, I was thinking to myself, no, I'm quite glad now we've come in the Jeep this little extra bit. But yeah, we all jumped out and then we were off. So we set off first, and it was so hot, and obviously there's bits of farmland going across towards the forest. So we were out in the blazing sun. I think it was only probably still about 9 o'clock in the morning at this point, but no shade.
With long sleeves on. With
long sleeves and long trousers and socks pulled up over the top. But I was really glad of that, because the guide stood behind me, the porter stood behind me, did actually stop me at one point on the way down. She'd spotted a fire ant on the back of my boot and picked it out. So if I hadn't put my socks over the top, that could have well been a very nasty
crawling up your trouser leg.
Yeah. So we went across. I have no concept of time for this morning because I think I was too excited. Didn't look at my watch, but I would hazard a guess we probably walked for about 40 minutes or so before we actually hit the edge of the forest.
Yeah.
And then that was it, then into the cool of the forest, and we were sort of back into, and again, didn't really notice time passing because we're nattering amongst ourselves in the group, talking to our porters. Again, at a guess, maybe another sort of half hour or so, and the group comes to a stop. We kept sort of having water breaks and that, and the group comes to a stop, and you think, oh, it's another quick water break. And they said to you, it's time to put on the masks. And obviously at that point, we've got the little old sort of blue style face masks that we have to put on when we're near the animals. We had it the same with the chimpanzees, just to sort of prevent us from passing anything to them, stop them from passing anything to us.
They're 98% our DNA, aren't they? So
yeah.
Everything that we're carrying, they can also carry. I mean, you don't have any concept in time at all, Lindsay, because it was actually, we were 2 hours trekking before we got to the stop.
Right.
So yeah, you were right. It was about 40 minutes of going through the farmland before we reached the edge of the forest, really. And then we were about another hour and 20, hour and 30 before we actually got to the clearing that they had made, where we kind of had to leave the sticks, leave our bags. And the excitement then, you could just feel it in the group that it was just like people were ready to go, weren't they?
Yeah. So we left our porters there as well with the stuff, because that's as well, we were talking at the start about maybe sharing a porter so that there wasn't too many people when we got to the gorillas. But we forgot about that idea, and the porters do actually hang back so that there's only you and the trackers in when you sort of come into the clearing. So they all stayed with the staffs and the bags, and away we went. And we literally sort of put our masks on, went round this huge bush, and there was Mukunguzi sitting there having a chill out and stuff in his face. And everybody just sort of like kind of stopped. And we were about 6 foot away from him at that point.
What's obviously, what's your thoughts on this? Because obviously the ruling is, like, you read about it, that you shouldn't get any closer than 8 meters to the gorillas.
Yeah.
And that's highlighted on everything, at the park gates. And I kind of feel that, well, it basically did just go out the window, didn't it? Like, there was no, but I feel from it from two perspectives, because one is, I think, because it's called the Impenetrable Forest, if you had to stay 8 meters away, you wouldn't see them.
No.
But also as well, like, they are really intrigued. Like, they are coming to you. Like, you can't stay 8 meters, can you?
No. And I was quite shocked by how close the trackers are. The trackers know them. The trackers know their sort of full behaviours and that. And it is forest, and they are hiding in the bushes. But when the trackers get close with their machetes and drag part of the forest out the way, they kind of look, but they're not getting up and walking straight away and getting straight back in the forest. They're quite happy sitting there, watching you, watching them. And I was kind of torn. I was pleased they were doing it because we got so much closer than I ever thought, and we had so many clear views. But at the same time, it was a little bit like when we were doing the Iceland trekking over the glacier. And I was like, I'm trekking a glacier, but am I damaging the glacier? It's that whole sort of warring thing going on. Are we too close? Are we affecting them? But I wanted to get closer because it was so addictive, and you wanted to sort of take that perfect shot or sort of sit there watching them without your camera for a minute. And yeah, it's even now, it's sort of stuck both ways in my head that it was amazing to get so close to them. But then sometimes they were, as you say, they were walking closer towards us as they were sort of moving on to the next patch.
Yeah, I mean, it was like that bit, the final bit where we were watching them for quite a while, and the silverback just came down and literally, like, brushed past me, and then went and sat next to that tree. And I'm like, well, I was 6 meters away from you and you've now come and sat a meter away from me and brushed past me, and I haven't moved. And I just think, like, if you didn't want to do that, then you wouldn't have done it. And there was a couple of times where the silverback kind of got a little bit agitated if one of the mothers and the babies had got too close to the humans. He then kind of made a grunt, and it was almost like he was telling them to move away to protect their babies. But they were very intrigued, weren't they? They were, like at one point, again, I was taking a photo of one and was quite a way back. And next minute I hear this rummaging, and there's one that just literally comes down and, like, walks right past my feet and, like, almost put his hand on my foot as it was walking past. And I'm like, well, if you didn't want to be that close to me, you wouldn't be. I'm not putting myself on you. You're coming to me. But yeah, I did, obviously, when you're in the moment, it's all about, like you say, like, trying to do it. But I did afterwards, sort of, that was going through my mind and thinking, and I was thinking about that a bit. And I'm still quite torn on it, but I think it's up to you, isn't it? You can stay further away if you want to. It's your own kind of personal preference, in essence.
Yeah. And I think I think when the silverback walked in front, I was trying to sort of get a picture of him. He'd gone a little bit back into the bush slightly. And as you say, I'm crouching down on the floor with my camera trying to get a picture of him through the leaves. And one of the young juveniles, probably about 1 year old or something, walks right in front of me. And he was that close to me. I tried to take a picture as he walked past, and it's just this black blur on my camera because he was far too close. Fortunately, somebody else in the group was recording and managed to get a 4-second video of him walking in front of me. And that's what I keep showing people, and everyone's like, I can't believe you got so close. And I'm like, are you saying I can't believe you got so close because it's a good thing or a bad thing?
Yeah, I think, from a conservation perspective, you've only got to look that this is a good thing because, the figures have trebled in the last 20 years of what was there. Like, and obviously it is working. Like you say, there was 3 babies which were that for me, like seeing the silverback was great, but seeing the three little babies was, that 2-week-old baby, like it's the funniest thing to look at because it kind of just hasn't grown into its face. It looks a bit like Elvis with a quiff haircut. Like it's
big fluffy quiff.
Yeah. It was a magical experience. And like you say, being that close, and I don't think they were too bothered. Like they could have quite easily have gone off into the forest and, we never would have seen them. Like it's the word impenetrable forest is definitely what it is. Like you could, the job the trackers must have to do to track them and find them is unbelievable.
Yeah, I think without the trackers there pulling some of the vines and that out the way, you could have walked straight past them on a path and you wouldn't have known. If they were sitting still, you wouldn't have known they were there. It was that thick jungle.
And the thing that I loved was the trackers actually speaking to the gorillas. Yes. And like you would sit there and like, like the trackers would say to you, okay, stand still, don't move when like the silverback was moving through you. And then they would just start grunting at them as if they were having a conversation.
Yeah. And I think as well, they were doing it when he was grunting at the mothers with the babies, they were grunting back at him as well. And it was almost as though they were reassuring him that we weren't there to hurt him or his babies and females. But yeah, that was the whole thing. I knew it would be, but the whole hour that we were there, I mean, it sped past the hour that we were there, almost as much as the walk in there, which I thought was 40 minutes, and it was an hour and 20. But no,
it was very quick, wasn't it? In terms of like, well, it wasn't quick. We were there more than an hour in the end. Like I think we were like 4 minutes over. I think they were giving us a bit of extra time to get a photo, and then it was time to go. But we had Sue on the group. Sue was 70, and it was a lifelong dream to see a silverback in the wild for Sue. And I know that, I mean, Sue lives quite local to me, and she came to the office here. She'd seen the trip, seen that we were local to her, and she'd come and have a conversation with me. And it was, she was like, can I do this? Like, I'm 70, I'm going to be 70 when the trip is. And she was a little trooper on the trek. Like,
Duracell bunny, she was just away at the front. There was no stopping Sue whatsoever.
But I remember seeing her when she first saw the silverback, and the tears were just flooding out of her with the joy of seeing one and being, and like, she was like, I never realized I would be, have got that close to one. And although
it wasn't just us women that were crying as well.
No,
I mean, there was, Mick won't mind me saying he's a big guy. He's not big, but he's not he's not like a little flower or anything. No. And he was the same as me. He couldn't look at me because every time he looked at me, we set each other off crying. And I think that's what shook quite a lot of people, is just how emotional it was.
Yeah, I think so. I think you're right. I think it was definitely the highlight of the trip, and obviously why it is called the Gorilla Trekking Trip to Uganda. And obviously once we finished, it was about an hour's walk back out then, wasn't it, to go in. Everyone was in, oh, I can't believe this, I can't believe that. And it was, and I think that was the lovely part. The bit that I really enjoyed was the fact that because we had a group of 13 and we had to go into 2 different groups, like when we got back to the lodge, because we didn't see the other group then because obviously they had gone off and tracked a different family. And, and as you said, there was 17 gorillas in the family. I think we probably saw 10 or 11 of them that were, but, again, the guides were telling us that even though we've only seen 11, the trackers will make sure they find the other 6 to make sure that they're all right, and they can log down that they've seen them and that they know where they were. And there's that conservation is happening on a daily basis. But the thing that I loved the most was the fact that we did have 2 groups go out, and therefore there were 2 different stories at the end of the day, because we had the afternoon in the bar then, and obviously everyone was telling their version of what they had done, and it was really interesting. I mean, obviously they had a few juvenile ones within their family. Unfortunately for them, they didn't have any babies like we did, but I mean, that's just luck of the draw in essence, isn't it?
Yeah, and they were telling us about the juveniles. The juveniles were like little kids, sort of like playing up in front of the people and dancing around and sort of climbing things and that. I mean, ours were quite a sedate group. We had one guy who sort of went up and down, one juvenile went up and down the tree and did show off a bit on his own, but they had the juveniles playing amongst themselves. And again, the photos, sharing the photos with each other and seeing what we both saw. And it was just, it was a lovely afternoon sitting around sharing between the 2 groups what we'd all sort of put ourselves through.
Yeah, definitely. So was it worth it?
Oh, hell yes. Just don't even have to think for a second about it. Yes. It was worth it. If the fees went up and doubled, it would be worth it. I would happily go back and do it all over again, just to go and see a different family. And I've promised Vivian in Country Guide, I'll be back before the 5 years are up.
There we go.
Yeah. Wonderful country.
What would you say to anyone that has either got this on their bucket list or has been listening to this now and gone, actually, that should be on my bucket list?
I would book it. Just, go and do it. I knew it was going to be incredible, but it was 10 times better than anything I ever imagined it could be. And I just don't think about it. Just book it. I'm going to do the whole spiel now. The bucket list company, pay for it monthly. You don't notice the payments going out. It is an expensive trip, but it's all the fees and everything you're paying for the parks and the safaris and everything that we did that week was worth every penny. So,
well, they are. There's a definite testimonial for us there, and I know if anyone's listened to my podcast where I talk about my top 5 trips, and everyone will know that Chile and Easter Island is the one that I always say, if I had to pick one, it would be that one. And I had the privilege of doing that trip with Lindsey as well. And I know we had the conversation after the gorilla trekking about which is our top trip now. And I think it's very difficult, isn't it?
It is 2 very totally different trips. And I would say instead of having a top 5, I would just have a joint top 2 and leave it as that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Lindsey, thanks ever so much for coming on and chatting with us today and talking about the gorilla trekking experience. Obviously, I'll put details of the trip in the show notes, and I'll also add in some blog posts that I've written as well since I've been back, where I compare Uganda and Rwanda and when the best time to go gorilla trekking is and those sorts of things. So you can really do your research and see if this trip is for you. But I think, listening to Lindsey, hearing what Lindsey has to say, and also, if you haven't listened to Tom's episode from last week, head back and give that one a listen. And that will give you a real kind of broad understanding of what this trip has to offer. And I think, as I said on last week's podcast, it was lovely to see, people commenting on the group's photos on the social media and saying how, they now need to add this trip to their bucket lists. And it was lovely to see a lot of our current customers who are, done other trips with us going, that one needs to go on my bucket list now. That trip looks amazing. And I don't think pictures and videos will ever do it justice. I don't think the day of first seeing your first gorilla, or the noise that those chimpanzees made when they came running through the forest, you are never going to be able to experience that unless you are there yourself. So if you want to have those experiences, where we are. We would love to take you back on there. And I've already said, I'm going to be leading the next one of these as well, because I think it, like Lindsey says, it needs to be, at least be a 2 times visit on this trip to kind of compare it and see the differences, because I think there would still be differences if you went back and did it again, and different experiences to be had. But I think it's definitely one, though, that you need to do once. So if you want to add this to your bucket list, you know where we are. I'll be back next week with another episode of the Bucket Lister podcast. Thanks again, Lindsey, for coming on this week. It's always a pleasure to speak to you. Enjoy the rest of your 50th year. And I know we've got another couple of trips to do this year, because you are having a travel year for your birthday. So I will see you again scuba diving in Gozo in a few months' time. But thanks ever so much for listening. Hope you found this episode useful, and I'll be back next week with another episode. Until then, thanks very much. Goodbye.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Bucket Lister podcast. Be sure to click follow to be alerted for next week's episode. For more travel inspiration, check us out at www.thebucketlistcompany.co.uk or follow us on socials. See you next time.